But yeah, I think we can start.
Okay. So let's get right into the proceedings of the day. Yes, please, into the presentation mode. So welcome everyone on behalf of RRA Network and the Millet Foundation to the No Millets webinar series. This is the fifth episode or fifth session of the series. And today we are going to be talking about grain characteristics, some information about the structural, nutritional, and storage issues of these grains. But before we get into that, I would like to take a minute to just talk a little about millets and or rather RRA Network and the Millet Foundation. And of course, our moderator of the day, Dr. Amrita Hazra. So let's start with RRA. RRA is a network of organizations which have come together to work on revitalization of rain-fed farming. And RRA stands for Revitalization of Rain-Fed Agriculture. And it's a loosely held coalition network and not a formal organization, and works through various organizations both in the field as well as in research and policy. Most of the network's efforts are focused on policy level interventions to take the learnings from individual organizations and fields into the policy rooms and try to get stakeholders who typically don't find a seat in these consultations and deliberations to bring in their voices in such places. So one of such partnerships is with the Millet Foundation. The Millet Foundation is a very nascent, small resource group to work on the millets ecosystem. We started this back in 2014-15, and we have been supporting various organizations with resources, both technical as well as what would be considered as soft skills. And this No Millets webinar series is also coming out of such an initiative where we are trying to get more and more people to recognize the value of millets and how we can get to know them better so that we can derive better benefits from them, as well as be a better and more responsible and more sustainable player in the ecosystem. So as part of these series, my name is Dwiji, and I have been presenting on various topics. And today we'll be talking about grain characteristics. And luckily for us, Dr. Amrita Hazra has agreed to moderate this session. And Dr. Hazra has been, she's trained in chemistry and biology and works on vitamins and how they are produced and various dimensions regarding that. But her connections to millets is from at least about 5-10 years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amrita, please. When she started working on and founded a project, in the Millet Project, when she was doing her PhD in Berkeley in the US. So, Berkeley in the US. Yeah, so we are having some issues on Amrita's audio, so let's please be a little patient with that. Over to you, Amrita, to just give your opening remarks, and then I'll start with my presentation. Can you hear me?
I think Amrita is not able to.
Yeah.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah. I can hear you. Yeah, she is. Yeah.
So, Amrita, I was just saying that I just introduced you.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks. Question. I think I sort of lost the connectivity at that point for a little bit.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just asked if you would like to say a few opening remarks before we start with the presentation.
Sure, I can. Thanks again for inviting me to moderate this session, and I feel like this whole idea of introducing all of us to these different dimensions of millets is it's an excellent idea. So about specifically about the session, I had a brief chat with Dwiji yesterday, and it's really important that we understand a little bit about the morphology and or how the grain looks and what the grain consists of to be able to use it more efficiently in our food, because it's a grain that is very different from the grains that we commonly eat, such as wheat and corn and rice. Those are the ones that are more commonly available, but these grains are different and they have, uh, because they're different, they have a unique set of uh, 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 nutrition features, which I think, however, they look different and they need different storage mechanisms, they need different processing mechanisms, and I think that would be something that we look forward to in this session. I leave it to Dwiji to take us through this.
Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you, Amrita.
Uh, Correction or an addendum to that. So I started with the idea that Amrita just described of walking through the nutrition and other things, and I found a lot of overlap with the second presentation. So Rahul, I would just like you to open the presentation for the second session on another screen and just keep it at hand. We will bring that in at some points. Um, just Rahul, if you can just confirm that you got that message. No, you don't need to project it now. I was just asking that you keep it open so that let this be on the screen.
Sure, I will.
You
But
can keep it on
yeah,
another screen. That would be good. Or
okay.
if you cannot toggle between screens, just let it be. We will come
Yeah.
back to that at the end.
Okay.
So let's get started. So grain characteristics, I wanted to look at the structural, nutritional, and storage aspects of grains and deliberate that share some experiences and insights into that. And in fact, even last evening when I talked to Amrita, we had a long discussion about this, or reasonably long. So, but as I started let's go to the next slide. As I started putting the slides together, I realized that there are certain things that I would like to do a little differently, because in this web series we have been talking about different aspects and ecology, historical context, and various other things, and some of these are still coming up. We started with a community-centric approach and why millets and community-centric approach go together, and then we went to the nutrition and value addition and how we can recognize these grains and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. So today we are going to look at grain characteristics. Let's go to the next slide. So why use characteristics is one of the first questions that I would like to address in this presentation, and then look at how, and then look at the storage, and then summarize. So I've taken a slight deviation from what I had discussed with Amrita yesterday, primarily because I felt the tools are more important than the actual grains and various things, because like I mentioned in the other webinars, I have been addressing some of these aspects, and I felt just adding a small delta is not going to be as good as revealing or sharing how we can get this data. So I'll go back to the second webinar's presentation for a brief 2 minutes towards the end. So I'll try to run through this a little faster than usual. So let's go to the next slide. So this whole next slide business is happening because my network is so. So Rahul, one of our co-hosts, is thankfully hosting the audio or the video of this. So he's sharing his screen. So it would be good to look at the characteristics of a grain or grains, primarily to map the variations, because we do have a lot of variations when it comes to millets. These are rain-fed crops, and therefore we have a lot of variations. So in order to identify what would be the best deal I can get for, let's say, foxtail millet, in terms of which grain would be most suited for the purpose that I'm using, it's important to characterize it. And then, of course, whenever we are talking of any crop or deriving any benefits, we want to always work towards improvements. So varietal improvement also necessitates that we characterize the grains and try to identify, what is that spread in their characteristics, what is the peak values and stuff like that. And of course, whenever we are communicating with one another, I mean, I can share this photograph, and Rahul, can you just go back to the previous slide? So these two photographs that you see in these two slides are both of prosumillet grains. And the one in on the screen now is actually of the cleaned variety and cleaned for seed. So this is seed quality grains. And go to the next slide, please. And this is how it landed. So you can see that, if we characterize the grains, then we would have a better we would be able to better communicate what is the quality of the material that we have. So that's why we would like to characterize. But other than this, there's also some intrinsic benefit. So first thing is that we would know them better. I mean, right now, the knowledge of these grains, like Amrita was pointing out, is fairly sketchy. So just being able to identify what is the spread in the sizes of prosumillet or colors or sphericity, so stuff like that. So any characteristic, if we take about the grain, it would be good to know about them. And of course, the agrobiodiversity. How do these grains grow when they are cultivated as a monocrop? How would their characteristics change if they were cultivated as as part of a larger agricultural complex? So these aspects also are intrinsic benefits which are non-monetary in some sense, but of extremely high value, and it would be good to indulge in these activities. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what are the parameters? There are various parameters, but these are the most easily accessible ones. So the first one is, of course, size. What is the size of the grain? What is the color? What is the shape? And what are the layers? How are the layers? How thick, thin, brittle, hard, various aspects of the layers. And then, of course, the moisture content, because we are talking about cereal grains. Moisture content is a significantly important factor that we need to keep in mind. So parameters are not just in terms of physical parameters. Because we use them as food, we do want some kind of handle on how they cook. So water, heat, and pressure. I mean, these are the three typical influences that we, or handles that we have in making food grain palatable, digestible. So these give us various parameters that I'll just touch upon briefly. I'll focus mostly on the physical today just because of time constraints. Maybe in another session or in another series, not in this series, but in as an independent webinar, we could talk about the cooking characteristics as well. So let's go to the next slide. So what are the tools that we use when we look at when we are trying to identify the physical characteristics? So as you might have noticed in the earlier photographs as well, there's always a scale in my photographs of samples. And that's because the size scale is extremely important. And in a photograph, we can't really make out whether it is a millimeter or a centimeter or a meter. And it could just be depending, the whole zoom and how much is the depth of field and all those things. So we invariably insist on there being a size scale to give us a clear picture of what is the size measure. The other thing is that we should be very clear that we are sampling. It's not that we are taking every grain and measuring them. So we should be aware and use appropriate sampling techniques whenever we are picking out samples. With most grains, as long as it's coming from a single field, um, you know, I would say, five pinches from a sack is more than enough to be representative, um, because it's not like 500 is going to improve the value a whole lot. It will improve, but 500 samples will take a lot of time and effort. So it's always a compromise between time and effort and accuracy. So just make sure that you get a representative sample and use appropriate lighting. And the magnifying glass, ruler, and camera are the three tools that we need. And of course, the procedure is simply what we use for most characterization exercises, which is to observe, make notes, discuss, and then repeat. Let's go to the next slide. So the magnifying glass is extremely useful, the one that you see in the photographs here. So I have just shown it in different, this is 10x magnification. You can get 20x and sometimes even 50x, but 10x is more than enough. And the photograph on the right is how the grains will look when you look through the glasses. And this is, of course, a photo that was taken through the glasses. And this is how the packaging looks. So most organizations that are working on millets, whenever I go visit them, I just take a box of a dozen or so and give it to them, because anybody who's in the field, anybody who needs to communicate about millets, they should be able to observe and describe it, if not, at least, if not, take a photograph and send it. So and also it helps in when we look for samples and when we are looking for particular characteristics, it's important to be able to magnify it and see it more clearly. So these glasses are very useful. So let's go to the next slide. So I use these things, and taking photographs is also something that we need to develop over time. So on my left, or on our left, as we look at the screen, um, the the grains are sparse and spread out, so I can actually see the clear boundaries. While and if I taken a photograph like that, I can also magnify and be able to delineate the grain from the background. The photograph on the right, it doesn't allow me to distinguish between the edges. It doesn't give me the tips of the grain very clearly, so it becomes quite a mess. So when we are taking sample photographs, it's always good to do it like this, on the left rather than on the right. So these photographs are again very important, because and of course this is scale measure. That's another very important thing to have in a sample photograph. So these photographs are very important because the photographs convey a lot more than what words can. And not that the words don't help, they help a lot. In fact, photographs can be quite deceptive sometimes, even with the size, scale, and everything. So it's always making notes and sharing them as well in order to communicate about these grains. So let's go to the next one. So that was a quick thing about the grains and their physical characteristics. We'll just look a little, go into a little bit about the cooking characteristics as well. And what are the parameters that we use? We have already mentioned that. So in terms of techniques, well, with cooking, as most people know, especially women know, you need to be quite patient, because things can go wrong quite easily. So make sure that you have your objectives and other things, your design of experiments in some sense, ready, and make sure that you have a comparison with you at any point in time, because boiling temperature and duration for to boil, all these vary. So use a standard measure like 1 liter of water, and while you are preparing whatever you're preparing, so that in parallel, so that you have a weighted scores in some sense, in order to identify how much water it takes, how much time it took, and what kind of pressures it took. Instruments can be multiple and it can be varied. We can get creative about these things, but essentially we need to measure volume, we need to measure weight, and we need to measure temperature and time. So as long as we have things to measure these parameters, we are good when it comes to cooking characteristics. And of course, visual observations, I have not put it in here, but it's quite and in characterizing the cooking aspects of these grains, we need to also put this additional thing about trials, because I mean, even with visual observation of physical characteristics, we do take multiple trials. But with cooking, it becomes even more important. We should not just decide on the basis of one, cooking once, that this was the case or that was the case. So let's go to the next slide. So when we are looking at characteristics, both characterization of these grains as well as the products are very important. And one of the main motivations is to reach the nutritional quality to the customer. Now, folks might feel that this is a very odd photograph to use for storage, but there's something really unique about these grains, which actually comes out very clearly in this image, though it's not the highlight of the image. So if you observe closely on the light colored flour packet, there are these drops of oil that have formed on this plastic. Now that's the oil from the bran. It's not oil that fell on top of this cover. This packet was kept for a month. It was probably about 45 days, 50 days when this photograph was taken, between 45 and 50 days since packing. And this was actually the bran flour. It was not the regular flour, but bran flour. And you can see the amount of oil in it. And this plastic, this particular kind of plastic, is it cannot keep the oils in. It oozes out. So the oil came out, and it spread all over the cover, and it was actually dripping out of the cover. So that's how much fat there is in these grains, and it's extremely nutritious. These are very good essential fatty acids that our bodies can really make use of. So it's not just good for us; it's also good for various other species. As in, we are kind of late in the game, and we call these other species as pests and label them as pest infestations. But actually, these other species have been around way longer than we have been. And of course, because there is all this much oil in these grains, rancidity is a significant issue. And we'll just quickly go over some of these aspects of how we can deal with them. Next slide, please. So particularly in terms of challenges, pest infestation, with the husk grains, it's primarily in storage that you get infestation, and that too only after hulling. So only after the husk or the hull has been taken off is the nutrition unlocked for any species, other than birds, of course. But most of the insects that live off these grains, they can access them only when the husk has come off. And humans are, what shall I say, are prone to doing things, making things easy for other species as well, unwittingly. And therefore, any hulled rice that is kept around is available for pests. And as long as they can get to them and lay eggs, they will flourish. With the naked grains, the infestation can start from the farm itself, especially with sorghum, that is jowar, and pearl millet, which is bajra. They are quite susceptible to pests in the farm as well as off the farm, like in storage. Now, in terms of rancidity, its rancidity is, by the way, just oxidation of the fatty acids. And rancidity sets in at various times, depending on how much of the bran layer is exposed to the air. So bran damage and other things, we talked about this briefly in the previous session on processing. So if you'd like to know a little more about this, please do go to the RRA Network's YouTube channel and check out session 4. And we have had a reasonably detailed discussion on bran damage and bran. So rancidity sets in because bran has these fatty acids, and this is the nutritious part of the millets that we are seeking from millets. And therefore, in the rice, it's not so bad because it can stay anywhere from rice, I mean millet rice, 30 to 160 days, depending on how it was processed. We'll come to that. And with grits and rava, grits is basically dalia, nuchu in Kannada. So anywhere from 15 to 90 days, easily it can start seeing rancidity. Again, it depends on various parameters. With millet flours, it can be anywhere from 5 to 15 days, and very rare. And this is machine processed millet flour, by the way. And almost every flour that I've purchased in a store has gone rancid. Very, very rarely have I got fresh millet flour in a store. So whenever I need flour, I typically get the millet grains and get it milled and use it soon after milling. So let's go to the next slide. And actually, this is something that we have seen in traditional food use, food processing and food preparation as well. Especially those who use bajra or jowar would be able to relate to this, because whenever we want to make rotis with bajra jowar, we do ask that the flour be fresh. Okay, now when it comes to solving these issues, we need to take a systemic approach. We can't just look at it in terms of, oh, how do I keep it away from pests? Or how do I stop it from going rancid? What do I mean by systemic issues? We have to understand that pest infestation happens in some geographical location, in some physical space. So that space has to be appropriately designed so that there is no scope for any residual material that adult, bug or a moth would come and lay eggs in what we call as our food, but it's actually their food as well. But anyway, for the purposes of this discussion, let's recognize that they are pests, and we do need to keep it away from them if we don't want them to lay eggs. So we need to appropriately design our facilities. Anybody who's gone to a flour mill or a paddy rice mill would recognize or would remember how unhygienic that such places are when you have cobwebs and dust and grains lying around, rice lying around, bran strewn all over the place. We cannot expect that other species would be as stupid as us and not use that material. They would use that material and try to make something out of it. So they lay eggs and try to use it. So we need to start from there, and also then look at the machines and the tools that we use, the process that we use, how we handle material, the discipline and the skill among the operators to be able to do a good job of what they're doing. And that's why whenever we talk of sustainability, I insist on looking at the human aspect as well, and not just look at it as a product and commodity solution. This is actually about skill development and human development as well. Something that we really need to look at, especially in this whole post-pandemic economics that we are going to enter, or we are entering right now. So coming to the other challenge of rancidity, again, more than the facility, it's the machines, because damage to bran is very significant in the processing itself, and we need to minimize that. Again, in the fourth session, we have talked about it. I think in the seventh session we'll be talking about mechanized processing, and seventh or eighth, I'm not sure. Just check out the website, themillet.org/KMW2020, and Introduction to Mechanized Processing. I'll be spending a few minutes on brand damage in that segment as well. So we need to appropriately design our machines, tools, and process, and of course have proper discipline and skills to implement it in a way that the nutrition is conveyed to the consumer. Now, what is also important in all this is to recognize that all these can be achieved when, or best achieved, when we have shorter supply chains. Once we go for longer and longer supply chains, once the producer and consumer are separated by a large space and time, these things become very weak, and the process becomes much more spotty. So community-centric food systems is what we want to look for. And we talked about this in the first session. So do check it out on the RRA channel. There's a recording of the first session. Let's go to the next slide. So just to summarize quickly, we need to characterize so that we recognize for what they are, the grains. We need to innovate, improvise, and in some sense systematize the way we work in order to be able to characterize these things in terms of tools and techniques. And in order to overcome the storage challenges, we have to take a systemic approach rather than ad hoc, approach to looking at it as a purely packaging and literally packaging is what it is reduced to. But storage is not just about, or infestation during storage and infestation of pests in our food grains is not a storage issue. It's a systemic issue. It's a food systems issue. So that's my presentation for this one. Rahul, if you can just pull up the second session's presentation from the website.
Yes.
That would help. And maybe while you're doing that, Amrita, we could start with the Q&A maybe, and take that. We are also a little behind schedule.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think this was a really concise and clear view of what is commonly done to catch the grains. I think one of the questions that we've received are specifically, does proso millet get rancid after a long period? That is in a few months. But I just wanted to reframe it in the way that are there certain millets that get more rancid than others, and is there a reason behind them that you could give us?
Yeah, sure. So can we go to the nutrition slide, Rahul? The table, yeah, this one. So the point that I was making about oils and rancidity can be seen in this slide. So if you look at the fatty acids or fat in grams, that's the third column. You'll see that pearl millet has 4.8, barnyard has 4.8, little millet has 4.7, proso has 1.1, and foxtail has 4.3 grams for every 100 grams of dry grain. So proso is not necessarily that, it's not that proso has more fatty acids and therefore it'll go rancid sooner. It's just that the grain structure, and this is where, looking at the overall characteristics is important. The grain structure is such that when we are processing proso millets, the grain is quite soft when compared to the other grains like barnyard or foxtail or even little millet. So what happens is that the rice, I'm talking about the rice processing here, as in proso millet or barnyard millet or foxtail millet rice processing. So when we dehusk, the damage to the bran is much more severe with proso millet than with barnyard or foxtail. So, but that doesn't mean that barnyard or foxtail millet does not go rancid. They do go rancid, but the one that we face most rancidity issues with is not in the rice form. It's more with the rava or the flour, especially the flour. Now, when you are processing for flour, you basically have to grind them into a flour. And the process of grinding, if it is done without care, and which is how it is done in most cases, it heats up the material. We all know this. Anybody who has gone to a flour mill knows how hot the flour is when it comes out of the machine. This is more so when you look at steel cut blades rather than blades as in the mills, rather than stone mills or emery mills. And if you go for the traditional hand milling using stone mills, हिंदी में जो चक्की पीसना बोलते हैं, not the the machine chakki but the hand chakki. So those grinding mills, biso kallo kannadalli, so these can be very effective and they don't heat up the flour. But of course it's manual labor, and if you want to mechanize it, it takes a lot more energy. So pulverizing is one of the solution that people have found out. Pulverizer works on a slightly different principle, and therefore flour from a pulverizer mill is reasonably better than from a grinding mill, which is the most commonly available mill. When we are talking of mechanized processing, we shall be touching upon this aspect of pulverizer mills as well as the grinding mills. So broadly speaking, it's not that proso millet is more susceptible. It's just that I had this proso millet sample and I decided to keep it for a year, and I didn't have to wait for a year. Within a few weeks, I could see the oil on it, and it was amazing. But I still did keep it for almost like 8 months. And yeah, it was amazing how much oil continued to ooze out of that packet.
Great, thanks, Vijay. You want to move the other presentation before we take more questions?
No, let's go to the questions itself because it's already 5:40. Maybe once we have exhausted the first round of questions, then I can come to this one a little.
Sure. Okay. So there's another question this time from the YouTube comments that can you give some on the effects of mixing different millets while we eat? And the question comes from the perspective of these multinational companies are always promoting these multi-grain and things like that. So is there sort of what are the benefits of mixing millets into cooking and into our eating in general? And the second part of the question is uh, the faster to slower rancidity spread in different millets. So is there again a range which I think you answered in the previous question? So
Yeah.
what's the multi-grain, I think, is what this question is mainly about.
Yeah, so that's a slightly longer answer. I'll just add to the second part actually. See, the strongest influence on rancidity is not the grain itself, it is how it was processed. What form it is, which is what I answered earlier, but not just what form, but how it is processed. So I was just mentioning about flour and using a pulverizer mill instead of a grinding mill. So, that makes a lot of difference in terms of rancidity. So it's not that this millet is more prone to rancidity and that millet is, it all depends on oxidation, and the oxidation depends primarily on how much of the surface area is exposed to air or to oxygen. So let's be cautious about not, and that's one of the reasons why I kind of changed my presentation to talk about the techniques rather than about the particular values or definite characteristics of individual grains, because we really need to improve on this. And in a 20-minute presentation, I figured I couldn't squeeze in or do justice to any particular grain if I went into the characterization. The first part of the question has been addressed in the second session, I believe, in the second session, Q&A. We have the Q&A and in written form as well as in the video on our website KMW 2020 on the millet.org. So please check it out. But briefly speaking, see, food is not something sacrosanct or it's not a one-time decision in life. We make a lot of compromises in life, and we make a lot of compromises in food as well. So it's always about trade-offs. So it's not like I can do without eating anything. I will eat something. I need to cook and feed myself and my family. So if the decision is between whole grain wheat flour versus what is touted as multi-millet or multi-grain flour, but it doesn't talk about whole grains or the fiber content in that is low, I would say go for something that has better fiber content, whole grain. And as I mentioned, this has been discussed both in the video of the second session, I believe, and also in the text form of Q&A. So please go to the website and check it out. And we can have a separate discussion on this at some other point in time if it's not very clear.
Great. Thanks, Vijay. Another really interesting question that one of our asked. So, like rice bran oils, are there oils of millet brans that are used anywhere?
That's a beautiful question. That's a beautiful question.
It's a really good one.
Yeah, it's a very important question because I'll take a couple of minutes for this because it's very important that we delve into this a little. I keep talking about food systems, and if you look at the introduction to the series or to this particular webinar, or even in some of the many of the slides, I have used food system multiple times because we cannot look at our food and nutrition from an individual perspective or from a single commodity perspective. We have to look at it from a systemic perspective, because otherwise we just can't be sustainable, and we cannot derive nutrition the way our body can assimilate unless we look at it as a systemic problem, or take a systemic approach to solving our nutrition problem. So bran was removed from the grain, from our paddy rice, primarily to make our processing or our rice mills more profitable. To diversify the income sources in rice processing, they decided to monetize bran and or take it out and monetize it in the form of rice bran oil. Now, most well, I don't know about the attendees, but I excuse me, but I guess Amrita may be excused, but the other volunteers may not remember this. But rice used to be that in such a form that we would have to pick out the the unhulled grains, the pebbles in it before we cooked it when we were much younger. But nowadays you just don't need to do that. You can directly pour from a packet into the vessel and wash it and use it. So the reason for that is that the value chain, the processing was reworked many times over, and one of the monetization of that value chain of the byproducts was the bran oil. Now, as you could possibly see from or remember from, or you can go back and see again in the nutrition table, the oil content in millet grains is way higher than paddy rice. So what does that mean? Yes, it does mean that it is available, but unfortunately for the business people and fortunately for us, extraction of bran from millet rice is not as profitable as it is from paddy rice. And therefore, consumers can still get the benefit if they know how to recognize bran in their food. Again, this has been discussed in the second session and or maybe third. I'm now getting a doubt. But anyway, we will put a link to that as well in the Q&A and other places. But do check out the other sessions, and we will also share a link to that discussion about how to identify brand. And we will be coming to this again when we talk about the quality concerns. And I think that's in the 6th or 7th session. Now I'm just getting confused again. Just check out the schedule of the series and mark the session on quality concerns, and you'll be able to I'll be talking more about this particular aspect of bran and bran oil, and how to recognize bran content in our food.
That's great, Vijay. Thanks for that. Um, so there's another question, sort of a follow-up of the first part, which we were discussing about the recipe. So how do you know that flour has gone rancid? Is one of our participants have asked, and I
Yeah,
think it's a great question. So important before you start making your chapati, your bhakri, or what,
correct,
that you know
correct,
that it's gone. How do you?
correct.
Is there a test? Is there an easy way to
Yeah,
know that?
yeah. So couple of ways in which you can test. I mean, mostly one I would say, but it's actually two senses, so we call it as two. So when you take the flour out of the packet or out of your box, the storage container, um, or let's start from the beginning. If you are cutting the packet or if you're opening a box that you haven't used for a long time, just try to do it with your nose, or focusing on your olfactory, your sense of smell, because smell is the first thing that hits you when something is rancid. It's like when oil is not good. If let's say you have fried something and you have kept the oil for 2-3 days, and you open the lid of the vessel in which you have kept the oil, you will get this strange bitter smell, and that's the first indicator that it's not good. The second thing, which a lot of old ladies, mostly ladies, have taught me, is that before you start cooking, you taste the ingredients. It doesn't matter whether you can taste it today or not. You start tasting the ingredients, because whatever you taste, you register that, and next time you're making, you're pretty much looking for something similar to that. So when you taste a rancid flour, it is quite bitter. If you taste fresh flour, it's not bitter. It has its own taste and its own aroma. But flour that's gone rancid is invariably bitter. And the third stage are the same thing. So you can also taste it much later after you have mixed it up. But that's kind of, you have already spent some effort on it. But still, before you make the rotis, after you have mixed the dough, you can again taste it, because with the water, the taste comes out even better. And probably you would have added a little bit of salt. So the bitterness would be even more enhanced if there is some salt in it. So yeah, I mean, taste is the primary way, but smell is a certain giveaway even before you get to taste.
Great, Vijay. Just one one thing that one of our attendees have asked: what is rancidity in Telugu? What does it mean? If you could just,
తెలుగులో ఏమంటారో తెలియదండి. వాట్ ఈస్ రాన్సిటీ? సి చేదు లాగా వస్తుంది. టేస్ట్ చేదు అంటారు. చేదు వచ్చేసింది అంటారు కదా. ఈ సమ్ ఫ్రైడ్ ఐటమ్ ఇఫ్ యూ జంతికలు ఇవన్నీ ఎక్కువ రోజు పెట్టుకున్నారంటే ఉంచుకున్నారంటే ఒకలాగా రకాలుగా అది టేస్ట్ తాడొస్తుంది కదా. సో దట్ ఈస్ ద టేస్ట్ దట్ వి మీన్ బై బిటర్నెస్, చేదు. Sorry, Samrita, I don't know if
there's another question. No, I just wanted it to be clarified so that the participant can follow
Sure.
the
Sure.
discussion. There's a lot of back and forth on rancidity. Yeah. Okay, so there's another question about when you make. So in this case, when you make cookies with unpolished barnyard millet, it tastes bitter. But when you do it with polished millet, it does not taste bitter.
Yes.
So what is the sort of what is the principle, or what is happening there?
Yeah. This brings in a very nice dimension to this discussion. Thank you for this question. This actually highlights one of the things that I was stressing in some of the earlier discussions also, that it's not like every ingredient can be used for everything. So we have to recognize what is the contribution to taste coming from. Where is the contribution to taste coming from? So I really appreciate that you have observed that when you use the whole grain rice, the one with the bran still on, not the husk, the bran, and that the cookies become bitter. But when you do it with polished, it does not become bitter. That's because of the bran content. There are two factors here. One is that the bran content has the oil, and the oil goes rancid when you are baking it because you're exposing it to a very high temperature. So even though you would have mixed it with other things and all that, your fatty acids will go rancid. But it's not just because of the fatty acids, it's also because of the fiber content. So your bran also has fiber in it. That fiber is not going, it needs water. You need to moisten up the fiber in order for us to be able to eat and digest it. When you bake fibrous foods, if you're if you're a regular baker, you would bake pumpkins, you would bake pumpkin, I mean sweet pumpkin, or you would bake potatoes, you might even bake beans and carrots. But you wouldn't bake drumsticks, right? Because drumsticks are fibrous. Or you wouldn't bake, let's say, kohlrabi, right? Or lettuce, for that matter, lettuce or cabbage, right? So there are certain things that we bake, things that would be that would come out better, that would taste better, that would cook better when we bake. There are certain things that we boil, there are certain things that we fry. So understanding what happens with these grains or how we can use these grains is very important. I'm very happy to hear that you have experimented with polished and unpolished. So as rice, when we use it, rice as in millet rice, we need the bran layer, and that is where the nutrition is. Now cookies are an indulgence. I don't believe cookies are food. I mean, sorry, but it's not food for me, nor is it for most sustenance purposes. So as an indulgence, it's fine to take the bran off and use the fully bran scrubbed rice and make it into flour or make it into fine rava, and then use it for cookies. But if we want to use whole grain, it doesn't make sense. So let's be a little smart when we are cooking, when we are baking. And that's the whole objective of this series, so that people understand and put things in perspective. So while I say processing has to be such that the brand is conveyed to the consumer can decide how they want to use it. So I wouldn't say never wash the bran off. There are certain dishes for which it's better to take the bran off rather than use it with the bran. So yeah.
Yeah, great, Vijay. Thanks for that. There are two questions which I'm sort of going to combine because I think they have they're in the same direction. So I'm just, oh yeah, here it is. So how does that expiry date, use by date, how is that being printed on a label when you're picking up a packet in the market? And is that reliable is the question. And the second question which I would like to come at with is that how do you shorten the supply chain for these sources for people in the cities who necessarily don't have access to the grain at the beginning? So I think these two are sort of related, so if you could comment.
Yes. Again, good questions. Really like the second one especially, but the first one, the answer is fairly straightforward. Um, the expiry date is on typically on items that are harmful if you use it after the period that it has been quote unquote certified as in labeled for. So that's why they moved from expiry date to use by date, because the use by date is considered as an indicative date before which your product is going to be good, after which you cannot say whether it is good or bad. So the use by date is significant because of the retailing requirements. It is indicative more of when you should be buying or not buying, whether you should be buying or not buying the material. Because if I buy a half kg packet of millet rice, I will probably use it over 3 days, maybe 5 days, because I don't just eat that one particular grain, right? So I would cook other things too. So maybe 5 days, maybe even 15 days, right? But if I'm buying a 20 kg pack, then I better buy something that is really fresh, because I'm going to keep it for much longer. So the use by date is useful in that sense. It is not like a cutoff date after which you should not use your purchase. I would strongly recommend doing the same things that I mentioned for the flour earlier. Taste your rice before you cook it and make it a habit, because it doesn't matter what the use by date is. If it's gone rancid, don't use it, because it just upsets your family and gives the grain a bad name, and of course you as a cook a bad name. So I would say taste your grains, taste your rice, taste your ingredients before you cook them. And I taste my bitter gourd as well before I make whatever I make with my ingredients. So the good thing is that my daughter has picked up this thing, so she eats every vegetable raw. Well, she doesn't eat bitter gourd these days, but we can just make it into a habit to have a taste of whatever we are cooking. So that, of course, not green chilies. I mean, don't take me literally, please. But yeah, so that's the idea there. With regard to shorter supply chains, now, whether you're in a city or in a village, we can have shorter supply chains, because right now shorter supply chain primarily means that we are aiming to reduce the time and distance between source and consumer. So how can that be possible with millets? It's very much possible, because any city that you take within a 200-kilometer radius, I'm pretty sure at least 20% of the area even today has some millet cultivation going on, one millet or the other, even today. So let's be conscious of that. Our food chains, our food systems, not food chains, but food systems, our supply chains have become more market centric than either producer or consumer centric. We have to revise that. And this whole pandemic and the economic downturn that's coming about is in some sense a reminder for us that we have to change our food systems dramatically. And we know the state of our health, and the reasons for that is also fairly well understood today in 2020. If we still want to argue that no, we need to keep our food market centric and let market solve the problem, then I'm sorry, but folks have had their head in the sand for too long, and it's high time we pulled it out of there and started using it to some effect. And it is possible. It needs systemic changes, and it's not going to be cheap. Again, we will be addressing some of these questions in the consumer concerns session, probably the 8th one, I believe, but do check out the schedule for the series, and we'll discuss more about that in that session.
Great, Bridget. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we can take one and then we can go to your closing remarks, please.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so another question that was asked earlier on is that how does sprouting affect the grain characteristics and nutrition? And
Oh
I
my
would just
God.
like yeah, it's a very good question. And if you could add also whether sprouted grains can then be stored, what else could be
Yeah,
done with the sprouted grains? You could
yeah,
basically talk about that.
yeah. So whoever asked that question, I love you. Um, so it's very important for us to recognize that cooking and eating is not just a mechanical thing. It's very much a mind thing. We have to put our mind to it, and sprouting is an amazing way in which we can change the nutrition available. And probably, Amrita, you probably also have some experience, and I would love to hear your thoughts as well on this. Sprouting is something that really changes the grain's characteristics, and especially the bioavailability of nutrients, and that too the mineral nutrients. So this is because the grain has the plant is not putting out these grains to feed humans. It's putting it out so that its next generation will survive and thrive. So we have to be smart in recognizing when we will raid this bank that nature has provided us. So we typically harvest the grains and cook it and eat it, thinking that we will get the most nutrition. But a lot of people early on figured out that actually, you know what, when you sprout it, it becomes that much more available. And but of course, it's a lot more effort. So, and it requires a lot more energy and resources. So but if you look back at traditional foods, one of the first weaning foods that are used for babies to wean them off of mother's milk is actually sprouted cereal grains, not just one but multiple sprouted cereal grains that are dried, ground into a flour, and again, not in a machine but typically in a hand mill, manually operated mill. And that porridge made from that is used as the weaning food. And the reason for that is that the proteins in these grains become that much more accessible to the body, to the human digestive system, when it has already been sprouted. So sprouting is an amazing way. It's an intensive way, but it's an amazing way of consuming these grains. But it's not a blanket. Please be conscious that some grains are not conducive for sprouting. The naked grains, especially bajra and jowar, I shouldn't say naked grains because ragi is quite conducive for sprouting. But bajra and jowar are typically not sprouted. Some folks have experimented with it, but one needs to be careful about bajra especially. Jowar is also, one needs to be careful, because what also happens is that the plant, when it is in its infant state, which is the sprout, also create, in some sense has its own defense mechanisms. And some of those defense mechanisms may not agree with many people. So when I'm talking about sprouting and using cereal grains, not just cereal but even pulses for that matter, one is very picky about which grains are chosen. We can share some resources. Please contact us online through any means, to know more about this or to discuss more about this. And there are a lot of people who have worked on this for a long time, who are much more knowledgeable. And maybe one of these future series that we do, we will have a session on just the sprouted foods. I will ask Amrita that you share your thoughts on this sprouting and also your closing remarks before we close this session.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Suji. And yes, even I thought this was a really good question because it sort of takes us a little away from the grains that we know, and we are adding a processing step, which is sprouting. But it's a processing step which actually makes the grain perhaps more accessible. So yeah, so sprouting, as Viji was saying, the grain basically has packed all its nutrition into the seed so that the seed can set forth a new plant. And so sprouting is the first step in setting the new plant or starting off the new plant. And in the process, a lot of the carbohydrates and the fats that are in the seeds and the cotyledon in the structure of the seed that you see, there's a lot of fat, there's carbohydrate storage, and there's some protein that's stored. And the fat and the carbohydrates start getting converted into more easier, more accessible forms of nutrition for us and for the new plant that would come forth. And so sprouting is actually an excellent way to eat most of your grains, many of your the rajmas and the chaulis and things like that. Matki, all of these are very good examples of sprouting, making the grain accessible for us to eat. Sprouting is a very important step in the process of malting, which is, I think, essentially what Dwiji was referring to for making the baby porridge. So it's basically where you sprout the grain, you sun dry it, and then you grind it up, and then that is malt, which Horlicks has popularized in their bottles for all these years. But that's all it is. It's essentially sprouted grain, which is dried and then ground into this very pleasant tasting powder. So these are ways in which sprouting really sort of helps get more nutrition. And sprouting and then malting is also an important step in the making of beer. A lot of beverages, a lot of alcoholic beverages are the starting point is a malt, and the reason being the same, that a lot of microbes that are going to work on the grain at that point will be needing a variety of nutrients easily. Malt helps us to do that. So I think that's what I can add to the sprouting, and I think it's an excellent idea to sprout millets. Jawar sprouting, I actually have personally done. I've seen it happening. I think it's more widely used than bajra sprouting. Bajra sprouting has recently been used for making beer. So I know that it's possible, but I just don't know how good it is as in its sprouted form, how good it is for humans at that point. So I hope that's helped. And with that, I'd like to wrap up this really useful session on grain characteristics, structure, and storage. I feel like we had a lot of our questions answered on this idea of when you're trying to consume millet, what form of it would be easiest to store. I think there are some questions which didn't get answered. Somebody asked whether it would help refrigerate the flour, and yes, of course, refrigeration or cooling would help to elongate the duration of your grain being better. But it's best to always freshly mill, like what Vijay was saying. If there is a way to freshly mill and use your grain, it doesn't get better. It's the most nutritious way to food. So I think we've covered how grains are characterized, how you can characterize grains if you find them, how you process or how industry or how a small industry processes these grains, what would be good practices for storing and using these grains, and some other of the excellent, from the question answer session, excellent insights into other ways of getting nutrition from millets. So with that, I would like to conclude this session and thank all our attendees and all the people who've helped put up this show along with Viji and me who are speaking. There are people behind this who are doing a lot of background work. So I'd really like to thank them. And I hope all of us can join again for the next session, which is the next Know Your Millet session. I'll hand it over to Viji to close.
Thank you, Amrita. Folks, the next session is going to be in the third day from today, so that's on the 19th. And do check out the millet.org KMW 2020 to get the schedule. And the website also has the link to the registration form. Circulate among friends, whoever hasn't heard about it, or family or colleagues, and ask them to sign up. There's also more information about millets and rain-fed farming and other things on our websites. Feel free to browse. And the webinar series webpage, KMW 2020, also has the slides, the recordings, the Q&A, and some kind of a summary of the session in numbers on that web page itself. So feel free to browse those whenever you want, bookmark it, come back to it, and of course come back to the next session as well. We look forward to another very interesting topic on millets that we'll be taking up in the next session. So thank you everyone, and have a good day, and hope you found this useful session, and will spread the word and ask more of your friends and family to